Hello, welcome to our conference presentation. Our topic will be on self-determined learners and academic mindset, how meeting basic psychological needs can improve intrinsic motivation. So for today's agenda, we will be discussing the following. First, we will introduce the team and say a little bit about ourselves. Next, we will introduce the topic we are presenting, as well as some of the key concepts and definitions. Next, we will summarize the literature we use in our research and summarize some of the key points. And then lastly, we will discuss potential implications of our topic and how we can apply them to our high schools and middle schools, especially with regards to the social studies and ELA content areas. So let's meet the team. First, we got Maggie Cahill, who teaches middle school English in Sacramento, California. Next, we have Matt Curoe, who teaches high school English in Brownsville, Texas. Next, we got Chris Sullivan, who teaches high school social studies in St. Petersburg, Florida. And then last, we have yours truly, Alex Weishan, who teaches high school social studies in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So, for our presentation, we will be addressing the following topics. First, we'll be talking about the environments and contexts that our students live and work in. Next, we'll be talking about mastery goals and how teachers structure their classrooms around student mastery of the material. And then we'll be talking about student intrinsic motivation and the ways in which we as teachers can encourage intrinsic motivation from our students. So, the big idea here of our conference is that when students' psychological needs are met in an autonomous environment, especially one in which both students are intrinsically motivated, and also when teachers structure their curriculum around mastery goals, students are more likely to internalize and integrate values and goals into their own experiences and education. This will ultimately increase the motivation of students in school. And in light of this infographic and the above what I just mentioned, we will be arguing for this conference that motivation ultimately depends on both teachers and students. And now I'd like to briefly discuss some of the terminology that we'll be using in this lesson. So, we would like to define mastery goals, which are broadly defined as the desire to help, develop, attain, or demonstrate competence at an activity. Individuals who possess mastery goal orientations engage in academic performance behaviors because of the desire to develop competence. As a result, mastery-oriented individuals show a pattern of preference for challenging tasks, persistence when faced with failure, higher levels of task enjoyment, and positive attitudes towards learning. Another important definition is intrinsic motivation, which describes the innate propensity to pursue interesting tasks that challenge one's skills and foster growth, and should have a positive link to performance. Conversely, we have extrinsic motivation, which is defined as an external incentive to engage in a specific activity, especially motivation arising from the expectation of punishment or reward. Now we will turn it over to Chris Sullivan, who's going to talk about self-determination theory.
All right, thank you, Alex. Next, we're going to discuss the first point on our chart here, which is meeting the psychological needs of our students and the importance of autonomy supportive environments. So there's three basic psychological needs. It includes competence, autonomy, and relatedness. First, we'll cover competence. That's when an individual feels that they are effectively interacting with their environment. Relatedness has to do with their sense of belonging in a social context. And lastly, autonomy, which is the extent to which an individual believes that they have control over their lives, right? That's a more obvious definition, but it's very important to adolescent development. So psychological needs, as we've described these three, are essential as a foundation for self-motivation. In other words, students aren't motivated intrinsically by themselves without these three core psychological needs being met. So it's essential that we do meet them. All three relate to a really basic human desire for two important things, which is agency and communion. Right? These things might seem contradictory, but in reality, they serve in competence, relatedness, and autonomy. We want some freedom, but we also want to feel united with people. That's true for adults as it is in adolescence. Excuse me. Another important factor is stage environment fix. Jackie Eccles is the predominant thinker on this. Essentially, it means that at different developmental levels, humans have different needs. So you want to be careful to meet the needs of your students at their developmental level. This is true throughout life too, right? We still want these all throughout life. We still want agency and communion, but it differs at different stages of life, what that looks like. Lastly, specific implications for teachers here is that teachers should entrust students with challenging but developmentally appropriate tasks. In other words, what you do in the classroom should be challenging for your students, but it has to be appropriate as well. We don't want to be so overwhelming that they don't feel confident in it, right? We also want to create a class culture of belonging. That's a really complex thing, but it boils down to students feeling like they are part of the classroom, that they feel like they belong, that they have, this could include things like friendship, maybe friendliness from peers or the teacher. And lastly, for autonomy, you want to give students voice and choice. This is a theme constantly discussed in our class, and that's an excellent point. You want to give them voice and choice in the activities that you're doing in class. Make sure that they are part of them, that they have a part in making them or establishing their own feelings and thoughts in them. Next, we'll discuss self-determination theory. This is another related and important theory. It relates to competence, autonomy, and relatedness. It's the things we just discussed. Essentially, the theory says this. Adolescents are more likely to be intrinsically motivated when their psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness are met. These three basic human needs are really important to adolescents, and they are more likely to be internally motivated when they're met. So if we boil that down to a more simple definition, essentially we're saying context really matters. And context matters for the school, it matters for your classroom. Students have a really natural tendency towards curiosity and inquisitiveness. You might not feel like that at the high school level if you're a high school teacher, but the authors are essentially arguing that from birth, right, children, toddlers, are naturally inquisitive. They want to know why. They ask that question a lot. Why is this happening to their parents? What is this? They have a really natural tendency towards curiosity. They want to know more. Even when you think about a baby moving around in their environment, picking up things, touching things, playing different games, trying to learn naturally. So research suggests that environmental factors can really help or hinder intrinsic motivation. If there is competence and autonomy and relatedness, then students will thrive, right? Their intrinsic motivation will thrive. They'll be motivated to do things for themselves. If that's lacking, it hurts the student's intrinsic motivation. Sometimes it makes it non-evident. So the role of teachers in this is that the environment that they create really matters for student motivation. It's essential that their classroom is a place where a student can be motivated because they feel like they're part of it and they feel like they have some choice in it, and that you have some degree of trust in their competence. Next, I'll turn it back to Matt.
All right, thanks, Chris. So now we're moving to our next one, which is intrinsic motivation and mastery goals. It is here on the green. And we're going to think about mastery goals and mediating between intrinsic motivation and performance mastery. So that kind of mastery at the end. So our first point is that intrinsic motivation tends to be positive, but it is not enough to guarantee performance and competency. So what I mean by that is, even though intrinsic motivation tends to be positively associated with engagement in performance behaviors, it is not sufficient causal condition for performance. That is, it is perfectly reasonable to simply enjoy a task and exert no effort whatsoever toward improving it. Take, for instance, a small child making music by banging on pots and pans. That child enjoys the task, but is not making any effort in improving their skills on those pots and pans. Now, intrinsic motivation also essentially describes the interest and enjoyment of an activity for its own sake, which means an individual could imaginably enjoy the performance of a given activity and persist at it for an extended period of times, yet poorly perform. Again, think about our child banging on the pots and pans to create music. Now, however, with mastery goals, we can use them as mediators in the relationship between prior levels of intrinsic motivation and the subsequent levels of performance behaviors afterwards. So if you think about it, with mastery goals, we can help focus students' efforts on activities that are competence rather than merely satisfaction relevant. So what I mean by that is, with mastery goals, we can take students from purely enjoying the material we are teaching, whether that's social studies content or English content, and work with them to develop a level of competence where they are working for accomplishing some sort of difficulty in the task rather than just enjoying the task. So if we go back to our child example, rather than just banging on the pots and pans, that child is now developing the skills and working towards being an accomplished drummer maybe in the future. So they're going to take the steps necessary to improve that task, not just simply banging on the pots and pans to make random music and sounds. So with that, there leads to be essentially two models for this achievement goal and these kind of relationships among mastery goals, intrinsic motivation, and performance. So the original model that came from achievement goal theorists was where mastery goals was needed to first help drive that intrinsic motivation. So you hear here in our little flow chart that we have mastery goals leading to intrinsic motivation, which then leads to performance. So mastery goals come first, which then impacts the intrinsic motivation, and then to performance and that competency in the area. So that is saying that first the child must have a sort of a want to be a good drummer before they find the enjoyment in drumming, rather than the new study here that Sullivan and Ford conducted was that the reciprocal model, that intrinsic motivation and mastery goal work hand in hand to lead to performance. So if you take our child example again, you might start with that enjoyment of making music on pots and pans, and then develop the mastery goals, which then further drives the intrinsic motivation, but also drives that child towards performance and competency in the difficult tasks. Now, if we're taking our students, they all come to class with a certain level of motivation, intrinsic motivation and sometimes extrinsic motivation. But if we're thinking about intrinsic motivation and the levels they come with class, they all have different interests depending on their context from outside school, which when coupled with mastery goals, so again, those two being in relationship together, drives us to the performance at the end. Those two things combined can help students get to where we want to go, which is why Sullivan and Ford concluded that any teacher would want to work and understand the context that the students are coming in with to achieve that level of intrinsic motivation and mastery goals to help drive student engagement and participation in the classroom. So now I'm going to turn it over to Maggie, who will continue to explain our next section.
Thanks, Matt. I am going to discuss the next parts of our circle, the last two parts of our little chart, being internalization and integration of values and goals, and then an increase in motivation because of that, which will eventually bring us back to needs being met in the autonomous environment due to that increase in motivation. So we used a Williams and Deci article for a lot of our research on the internalization due to self-determination theory, and it is integrated with all of the other articles that we've discussed. So students internalize behaviors and beliefs when they have intrinsic motivation and strong mastery goals set for them by their teachers. So that's kind of where this first bullet, or this first box, I should say, is leaving off, or picking up. So students are internalizing their behaviors and their beliefs. And then it is when students start integrating these behaviors and beliefs, which they will do in autonomous environments, It's when they start integrating these behaviors and beliefs that they will start to experience an increase in motivation. Because just internalizing the behaviors and beliefs is not enough. Students also need to be integrating these behaviors and beliefs into their own identity and their own selves. Otherwise, it just becomes like a very controlling, pressured sense of this is what I have to do, and so this is what I'm going to do. When those beliefs are integrated into who they are, they want to live out those beliefs and they want to achieve and succeed. So once they've integrated these behaviors and beliefs, then they will become even more autonomous in their own learning. So all of this internalization and integration begins in an autonomous learning environment, but then as students begin to internalize and integrate the behaviors and beliefs, they become even more autonomous, which then just feeds this cycle of an autonomous learning environment. Following that, student motivation will increase because their internal values that they've now developed and internalized and integrated will match and align with what they are doing and learning in the classroom. So what's happening in the classroom is no longer this separate thing that they have to get done because they have to get it done that's being like forced or oppressed on them. It's something that they want to be doing and something that aligns with who they are. If you're learning something that's aligning with who you are and what you believe, or even if it's something that you disagree with or that causes some sense of dissonance in your mind, if you can get behind the value of the education and the value of why you would be learning something, then that will develop a sense of satisfaction that, okay, even if I don't like this like 100%, or even if I don't 100% agree with this, I do have a sense of satisfaction that I am taking the time to learn it. They will also trust in their teacher and trust in their environment more. And so their basic psychological needs to belong and fit in and be in a place where they feel supported and cared for, those basic psychological needs will be met, which brings us all the way back to the beginning of our cycle that we created. So moving away from the cycle, getting into some practical solutions of how to implement this more theoretical stuff. The two main ways that we see as implementing our cycle of self-determination theory and goal theory into particularly ELA classrooms would be to foster autonomy and to achieve mastery goals, to help them achieve mastery goals. So some ways that you can foster autonomy in your classroom would be by giving students opportunities to choose what they get to read, topics that they are going to present on, topics they're going to research, giving them that sense of choice, and then encouraging them and coaching them in those choices. So not being like a silent figure, but being active and interactive with them along the way. Using higher level questioning, so not just settling for basic, simple questions, but getting them to really think through issues and themes, and encouraging them to put themselves into a text or put themselves into a poem or whatever you're reading in the class. Having a classroom library with lots of options for students to read, different types of options that encourages everyone to want to read something. Having in-class read-alouds is very encouraging to students because it helps them kind of break into a text rather than just reading something on their own and being confused. With an in-class read-aloud, they can hear how a text is supposed to be read, they can hear different intonations, they can have the teacher stop and explain things. It's just a more interactive way for students to feel like they can take charge of the reading rather than like having the reading or the text consume them. And then teaching them reading strategies so that when they are reading on their own, they know where to go and what to look for in a text. To help them achieve mastery goals, we can express the importance of reading in everyday life and be enthusiastic about reading and encourage them like, oh, reading is fun. You know, there's lots of different things we can read. You don't just have to read a novel. even when you're reading a text message, that's reading. So expressing like all the different places that reading shows up in their life, giving them fun and challenging activities. So enhancing just reading a text by acting it out or debating about a central theme or issue by playing some sort of game. Group work and group discussions, again, helps engage them with their peers and helps them feel less alone in the text and feel more encouraged to learn about the different facets of the text and help them feel interested in different facets of the text. Clear instructions and goals, which will help them obviously to achieve their goals, but will also help them to know what they're doing and what the expectations are so that they're not feeling lost and confused. And then grouping struggling readers with stronger readers to encourage a sense of support and to help those struggling readers gain a little bit more autonomy as they gain some of the skills that the stronger readers also have. And I will turn it over to Chris to discuss how we can implement these cycles into social studies class.
All right, thank you, Maggie. So we're going to discuss briefly the implementation of this for social studies classrooms. There's great opportunities in social studies classrooms to use this. We really have an opportunity to answer students' desires to know about the world and the peoples that occupy it. It's something that can be inherently interesting to some students, but for others, it's going to require more effort from us to build their intrinsic motivation and for them to build it for themselves. So students are really motivated when activities that they engage in allow them to be critical, exploratory, and autonomous. This aligns well with those three basic psychological needs. When those are fulfilled, they tend to do much better because they're interested in the work that they're doing. For social studies specifically, I'd say make use of real-world social and political problems. You don't have to speak in the abstract. There's problems that need solving today. And if you allow your students to engage with those questions, those difficult questions, you allow them to build their own both social and political identity in your classroom. You allow them that autonomy and creativity to come up with solutions. So in debate or discussion, you're giving students voice in your classroom. And you're allowing them to think differently about topics they may not agree with, right? You can have them take multiple perspectives on a matter, even ones they might disagree with, to build their skills in argumentation. Lastly, we just want to say thank you. Thanks for spending time with us today. We appreciate your time and we look forward to answering your questions.